The bright neon lights of the Eclipse Café flickered as the evening rain pelted the windows, turning the world outside into a blur of streaks and shadows. Inside, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air, inviting customers to seek refuge from the damp, cold night. A few loyal patrons sat at tables, sipping their drinks in quiet conversation, while the low hum of a jazz playlist set a relaxing ambience. The café, tucked away on a quiet street in the heart of Los Angeles, had a special charm. Its walls were adorned with photographs of celebrities and behind-the-scenes shots from movies, a nod to the entertainment industry that surrounded the city. But while the decor spoke to the glamorous world of Hollywood, Eclipse Café had built its reputation on something far more valuable: humility, warmth, and a sense of community. At the counter, Tom Cruise stood with a soft smile on his face as he wiped down the espresso machine. He wasn't the loud, attention-seeking star most people imagined. Instead, he was quiet, unassuming, and deeply invested in the cafe he had opened nearly a decade ago. Most people who walked in had no idea who he was. Not the real Tom Cruise, the actor, the icon. He didn't want fame or fortune here. He just wanted to create a space where people felt at home. But on this particular evening, everything was about to change. It had been a rough day. The cafe had been bustling with customers, and Tom, as usual, had done everything from brewing coffee to greeting newcomers with a friendly face. As the rain began to fall heavier outside, a sleek, black car pulled up to the curb, and a tall, well-dressed figure stepped out. It was Sandra Bullock, one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses, known for her wit and charm. She adjusted her umbrella as she hurried inside, clearly eager to escape the storm. She'd been in the area for a meeting and, on a whim, decided to drop by for a quick coffee. She pushed open the door, the little bell above it jingling softly, and entered the warmth of the cafe, shaking off the rain. The moment Sandra walked in, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The regulars glanced up from their drinks, their faces lighting up with recognition. "Is that Sandra Bullock?" one woman whispered to her friend, who nodded enthusiastically. A few people discreetly pulled out their phones to snap a picture, trying to keep their excitement in check. Sandra walked toward the counter, where Tom was waiting, a polite smile on his face as he greeted her. "Good evening. What can I get you?" Tom asked, his voice calm and welcoming. Sandra returned the smile, though her eyes flickered with a hint of exhaustion. She had had a long day. "Just a cappuccino, please," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Tom nodded and turned to prepare the drink, his back turned to Sandra for a moment. But as he reached for a mug, the sound of the door swinging open caught his attention. Two more figures entered the cafe, their laughter filling the space. They were clearly not locals, their heavy accents and rough mannerisms betraying their unfamiliarity with the place. The first man, a tall figure in a leather jacket, brushed past Sandra, as if she were an afterthought, heading directly to a table in the corner. The second man, shorter but stockier, looked Sandra up and down with a dismissive glance before heading to the counter. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice flat and disinterested. "We're looking for a seat. Is there one available?" Sandra, still standing by the counter, was taken aback by his abruptness. "I'm sure there's a table available," she replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. She wasn't in the mood for confrontation, but something about the way he spoke to her didn't sit right. Tom, sensing the tension in the air, turned around just in time to see the man's dismissive expression directed at Sandra. Before he could respond, the man added with a sneer, "This place looks like it's too small for someone like you. Maybe you should go somewhere else. It's not really your type." Sandra's smile faltered. Her expression softened with a quiet hurt, but she said nothing. She wasn't one to engage in petty arguments. Tom, however, wasn't so quick to overlook the behavior. He took a deep breath, the calm demeanor he usually wore slipping slightly as he turned his gaze toward the rude man. But instead of making a scene, he simply placed the cappuccino on the counter and looked the man dead in the eye. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave," Tom said quietly, his voice firm yet calm. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the unexpected response. "What? You're kicking me out?" He laughed, looking around as if trying to gauge the situation. Sandra, still standing there, felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't sure whether to be embarrassed or grateful. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up for her. Certainly not in such a subtle, dignified way. Tom's unwavering stance made the situation even more uncomfortable for the rude man, who now realized he had pushed too far. But he wasn't done. "Do you know who I am?" he sneered, his tone more mocking than anything. "I've got friends who can make sure places like this never survive." The words hit Sandra like a slap, but Tom didn't flinch. He didn't need to explain who he was, nor did he care about any threats this man might make. Instead, he stood tall and unshaken. "Leave," Tom repeated. "Now." The man stood for a moment longer, eyeing Tom with defiance. But eventually, realizing there was no point in pressing further, he muttered under his breath and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Sandra stood in stunned silence, the cappuccino still in front of her untouched. She didn't know what to say, but she felt a sense of awe that someone had intervened on her behalf. She turned toward Tom, who was already wiping down the counter again, as though nothing unusual had just happened. For a brief moment, there was an uneasy silence between them. Sandra opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was still processing the situation when Tom spoke up, his tone soft. "It's not about who you are," he said quietly, eyes meeting hers. "It's about how you treat others." Sandra blinked, startled by the simplicity yet depth of the statement. She had expected a grand speech or some sort of formal apology, but instead, Tom's words left her feeling more than a little humbled. She wasn't the only one who was surprised by the encounter. Tom's calm, steadfast demeanor spoke volumes. And in that moment, Sandra realized that there was more to him than met the eye. Little did she know, the true twist was yet to come. The rain continued to pour outside, relentless as ever, but inside Eclipse Café, the storm seemed to have calmed. The tension from the earlier confrontation hung in the air. But it was Tom Cruise's unspoken authority and calm demeanor that brought a strange sense of peace. Sandra stood in front of the counter, still unsure of how to respond to the kindness he'd shown her. Tom didn't speak another word, allowing the quiet between them to stretch out. There was something in his eyes, something that suggested he wasn't just another coffee shop owner trying to make a living. There was a depth, a quiet power that Sandra couldn't place. She had met thousands of people in her career, but there was an elusive quality about Tom that made her feel as though she had just stumbled upon someone far more extraordinary than she had realized. She glanced around the cafe, trying to gather her thoughts. The patrons who had witnessed the exchange had gone back to their conversations, but she could see the lingering glances they exchanged with each other. No one seemed to want to make a fuss, but they had all seen what had just happened. Sandra finally spoke, her voice soft but carrying a trace of genuine gratitude. "I didn't expect that," she admitted, trying to find the right words. "Thank you." Tom gave her a modest nod, his smile as humble as ever. "I wasn't about to let someone treat you like that," he replied simply. His tone was not one of pride, but of quiet resolve. He wasn't looking for praise, and he wasn't interested in drawing attention to himself. He was just doing what he believed was right. The hum of the cafe resumed, but Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Tom was not just any cafe owner. He had something more, something that didn't fit the picture she had in her mind. She set the cappuccino down on the counter, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup as her curiosity began to grow. "I don't mean to pry," she began hesitantly, "but why do you do this? Why this place? I mean, you could be anywhere. You could be doing anything." Tom paused, his eyes flickering over to her, as though he were measuring his response. For a moment he said nothing. Then, without missing a beat, he spoke. "I wanted to create a place where people could just be," he said. His words were simple, but carried a weight that Sandra could feel deep inside her. Everyone's rushing. Everyone's always on edge, trying to live up to something. I wanted to make a space where people could breathe, where they didn't have to worry about appearances or status, or how much money they have in their bank account. Sandra's brow furrowed slightly, intrigued by the simplicity of his answer. There was something about the way he spoke that made her feel as though he wasn't just talking about a coffee shop, but about life itself. Tom's voice softened even further, as if he were speaking to himself more than anyone else. When you strip away everything else, when you stop pretending to be someone you're not, you realize how much better things are. People need a place to remember that. A place to connect, not to impress. His words hung in the air. And for the first time in a long while, Sandra felt a pang of something unfamiliar. She had spent so many years in the public eye, living a life that was far removed from what Tom was describing. She was constantly judged by her looks, her choices, her career. And here, in this small cafe, she was being reminded of something she hadn't thought about in years: simplicity, authenticity, connection. Sandra had seen many sides of Hollywood. She had played glamorous roles, sat on red carpets with the brightest lights shining down on her, and endured the superficiality of the industry. But standing here, in a corner cafe where no one cared about her fame, she felt exposed in a way she had never experienced before. In a place like this, no one looked at her like she was a star. They saw her as just another person. Tom watched her closely, sensing her thoughts. He hadn't lived a life in the spotlight like Sandra had, but he knew the weight that came with it. He had never desired fame or adoration. It was the quieter things that filled him. Still, he couldn't help but feel a certain kinship with Sandra. She was one of the few people who had, in a way, become a prisoner of her own success. And he had seen enough of it to recognize the toll it took on someone. Before Sandra could respond, the door swung open once more, and a few more patrons walked in, chatting among themselves, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that had just passed through the cafe. Sandra was jolted out of her thoughts, and instinctively moved to step aside, not wanting to draw attention. But before she could, Tom held up a hand. "Stay," he said softly, his voice almost a command but without any harshness. "No one's going to bother you here." His words were like a balm, soothing her nerves. She stayed, watching as Tom moved behind the counter once more, his calm, collected energy continuing to fill the space. She couldn't help but feel a little more at ease, as if she had just stumbled into a world where things made sense again. The world outside, the one full of flashing cameras and red carpets, seemed like a distant memory in this small, humble cafe. As she sat, pondering the quiet wisdom in Tom's words, she had no idea that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could have anticipated. Something that would challenge not only her perception of the world around her, but also her understanding of the very nature of people and their hidden strengths. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering discomfort. There was something in the air, an unspoken question hanging between them, but she couldn't quite grasp it. She smiled politely, hoping to shift the mood. "So Tom," she began, trying to steer the conversation back to something more casual, "how did you end up here in a cafe like this? I mean, you don't exactly look like the typical cafe owner type." Tom paused, looking at her with a half-smile that held a hint of mystery. "You'd be surprised what people like me can do when they stop trying to be someone they're not." Sandra raised an eyebrow, intrigued but unsure where this conversation was headed. She hadn't expected this kind of answer, but she couldn't deny that Tom was sparking something in her. A curiosity she hadn't felt in years, and that she realized was the real charm of this place, this cafe. It wasn't the coffee or the pastries, though those were certainly great. It was the people who walked through the door, and the unexpected connections that were made. But little did Sandra know, the next few days would unravel a truth that would change everything she thought she knew about Tom Cruise. This wasn't just any cafe. And Tom, he wasn't just any man. The next few days passed by in a blur. Sandra found herself returning to Eclipse Cafe more often than she'd expected. Something about the unassuming space, and its owner drawing her in. She had always been a creature of habit, frequenting places that catered to the glittering world she inhabited, where everything was curated, polished, and designed to impress. Yet in the humble, dimly lit corners of the cafe, she felt a strange comfort. It wasn't about status or fame. There were no flashing lights, no cameras, no prying eyes. Just people, sharing a moment of quiet. But beneath the warmth of this sanctuary, a storm was brewing. It wasn't the kind of storm that came with thunder or heavy rain, but one of tension, slowly mounting and shifting beneath the surface. Sandra hadn't come to realize it yet, but Tom wasn't just any cafe owner. He was a man who carried a heavy history, A man who had chosen a path of anonymity, far removed from the fame and fortune he once had. He was a man who was struggling to keep a past, full of both glory and regret, buried under the simplicity of his current life. Tom, for his part, had never sought out Sandra's company with any ulterior motives. He simply admired her for her strength, for the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders, and yet still radiated a kindness that was rare in the industry. But as Sandra continued to visit, their conversations deepened, and Tom found himself pulled into a situation he hadn't anticipated. He hadn't expected to get involved with someone like Sandra, not again. Not after the years he'd spent building this quiet existence. And yet here she was asking questions, getting under his skin in ways that no one else ever had. One evening, as the cafe filled with the usual after-work crowd, a familiar face walked in. It was one of the men who had been rude to Sandra the day she arrived. Still smug, and with an air of arrogance that felt thick enough to cut through. Sandra, seated at her usual spot near the window, tried to ignore him. But the moment his eyes landed on her, he grinned with a cocky expression that made Sandra feel uneasy. Tom watched the interaction from behind the counter, his face a mask of indifference, though a spark of anger flickered behind his eyes. The man had returned, and he wasn't alone this time. He had brought a few more friends, all of them equally boisterous and dismissive of the quieter, humbler souls who made up the cafe's usual clientele. As they swaggered toward the counter, Tom did his best to remain calm. He had always prided himself on keeping the peace, but the presence of these men, especially the one who had insulted Sandra, was grating on his nerves. "Is this place still open for people like us?" the same man asked with a mocking laugh. His friends snickered behind him. Tom kept his voice steady. "Everyone is welcome here, as long as they respect others." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Respect? I don't see how you're running a cafe with such a low-key vibe. This place is practically a hole in the wall." Sandra felt her stomach churn at his words, the familiar sting of judgment creeping in. It wasn't the first time she'd been insulted in such a manner, but hearing it again in a place she thought was safe made her feel vulnerable. The man's friends glanced at each other, sharing looks of amusement. "Maybe we should take our business elsewhere," one of them chimed in, loud enough for everyone in the cafe to hear. "After all, it's not like we need to be here to get a good cup of coffee, right?" Sandra stood up slowly, trying to ignore the lump that had formed in her throat. She could feel her anger rising, but she knew better than to engage in a confrontation, especially not here, in a place that had become a small refuge. But Tom, who had been listening intently, took a few measured steps forward, his eyes narrowing at the group. "Maybe you should," Tom said, his voice cutting through the mockery. His calmness was a stark contrast to the growing tension in the room. The man sneered, clearly frustrated by Tom's unwavering composure. "You don't know who we are, do you?" he spat, a cruel smile stretching across his face. "We've got connections. You can't just throw people like us out of your cafe without consequences." The warning was clear. This wasn't just about a difference of opinion anymore. This was about power, about people who thought they could control spaces simply by virtue of their status. And though Tom had always steered clear of conflict, it was becoming increasingly clear that his world, the world he had so carefully created within these walls, was about to be challenged. Sandra, though, was caught off guard. She hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly. The cafe, the place she had come to find solace, was under attack, not from the usual external pressures, but from the very people who felt entitled to judge others based on their influence. And the truth was she was tired. Tired of the industry, tired of the constant grind to live up to some ideal, and now, tired of seeing Tom, a man who had nothing to prove to anyone, being dragged into this mess. Before she could step in, Tom spoke again, his voice lower now, a quiet but firm authority in it. "You may have connections, but I'm not afraid of you." He stepped closer, his gaze never wavering from the man's face. "What you don't understand is that this place, my place, is about more than just status or power. It's about respect." Sandra was struck by the weight of his words. There was no bravado, no threat in Tom's voice, just an unwavering confidence in what he believed. And in that moment, She knew this wasn't just about a simple confrontation. This was a battle for something much bigger. The man, taken aback by Tom's refusal to back down, hesitated for a moment. But then, with an exaggerated sigh, he turned to his friends. "Let's go," he said, motioning for them to leave. "This place isn't worth our time." As they stormed out, the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, but Sandra felt a strange unease settle in her chest. This wasn't the end. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning. The days after the confrontation in Eclipse Café felt like a delicate balancing act. While the cafe itself had returned to its usual rhythm, the undercurrent of tension simmered beneath the surface. Tom had always been good at handling small conflicts, those minor irritations that came with running a cafe, but this felt different. It wasn't just a matter of a few rude customers. It was a challenge to the very soul of what Eclipse represented. And no one, especially Tom, was willing to let it be tainted. Sandra's presence in the cafe had shifted too. It wasn't just about her searching for a quiet place to drink coffee anymore. She had become more attuned to what was happening around her, more aware of the subtle ways people interacted with Tom. It was almost as if there were two versions of him. The quiet, kind cafe owner who listened more than he spoke, and a man with a past that was still threatening to come to light. It seemed to her that every time she came back, she peeled back another layer of him, and with each new revelation, she felt more drawn to him. But what she didn't know was that Tom was fighting a battle within himself. His past, the one he had left behind so many years ago, was calling him back. It was a life he'd intentionally buried, thinking he could build something new. A simpler, quieter existence where he could make a real difference in the lives of others. But now, after years of peace, the familiar shadow of his former world was creeping back into his life. The arrogant man who had caused the first confrontation wasn't just a random customer. He was connected to the very people Tom had been avoiding for years. The man, Brad Sinclair, wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was part of the same elite circle that had once considered Tom their peer. Back when Tom had lived a life of luxury, before he'd walked away from it all, he'd rubbed shoulders with people like Brad. The world had been filled with excess, power plays, and shallow relationships. And Brad had been the worst of them all. Condescending, dismissive, and as hungry for dominance as anyone Tom had ever known. Brad had been the kind of person who would throw his weight around in a place like Eclipse Café, testing its boundaries, waiting to see who he could intimidate. Tom had made his choice long ago. He had left that world behind, hoping that he could find peace away from the glitz and grime of high society. But Brad's reappearance in the cafe felt like a direct challenge to that peace. A reminder that no matter how much Tom had changed, his past could still find him. It wasn't just Brad either. The man had made sure to spread the word, calling in favors and spreading rumors that Eclipse Café wasn't the place for people like them. Wealthy, powerful, and influential. Tom could sense it. The cafe had always been a sanctuary for regular people. Those who came for a quiet moment, free from judgment. But now, the gossip was beginning to spread, and more people from Brad's world were starting to show up. It wasn't just a few arrogant customers anymore. The tension in the cafe was palpable, and it was clear to Tom that his sanctuary was becoming a battleground for something much larger than coffee or pastries. Sandra was no fool. She had been watching the subtle changes herself. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but over the past few days, she noticed a shift. Tom was quieter, more withdrawn. She could see the weight on his shoulders, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of actors and celebrities who had been forced into hiding from the very world they once embraced. The weight of fame, the weight of expectations, pressing down on them like a heavy fog. But it wasn't just Tom who was affected. Sandra had started to feel the pressure too. The whispers from the higher-ups in Hollywood were becoming louder, more insistent. She had thought that stepping away from her usual circles and spending time in this small cafe would help her escape the chaos. But now it felt like the chaos was following her here. Her publicist had called, asking why she had been spending so much time in a place with no status. Her agent had reminded her that her brand, her image, mattered more than ever. And Brad's influence was starting to creep into her world as well. The more she came to Eclipse Cafe, the more she could feel the whispers about her choice to frequent such a low-profile place. One evening, as Sandra sat at her usual spot, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, a new customer walked in. He was well-dressed, his appearance strikingly polished, but it was the aura of authority that surrounded him that caught Sandra's attention. He moved with the same kind of confidence that Brad Sinclair had, but there was something more calculated in his movements, something colder. The man approached Tom at the counter, and Sandra, sensing a shift in the air, leaned in slightly to listen. "I hear this is where people who want to hide from the world come these days," the man said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Is that what this place is? A sanctuary for the washed up and the forgotten?" Tom didn't flinch. He continued to prepare the coffee, his back turned to the man. "Everyone is welcome here, as long as they respect others." The man smirked, clearly not used to being ignored. "Respect? You expect people like me to respect a place like this?" he asked louder now, as if trying to provoke a reaction. Sandra stood up at that moment, feeling the familiar surge of protectiveness overtake her. She wasn't sure why it mattered so much, but she couldn't help it. She walked over to the counter, standing beside Tom as she faced the man. "Maybe people like you don't understand respect," she said, her voice firm and surprisingly confident. "But here we respect kindness. We respect the people who aren't afraid to be real." The man stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. For a split second, Sandra thought he might lash out. But then, as quickly as it had come, the anger faded. He turned and walked out of the cafe without another word, leaving behind a room full of confused and curious patrons. Tom's eyes lingered on Sandra for a moment before he nodded his thanks, though his smile was still strained. He appreciated the gesture, but this wasn't just about protecting a cafe anymore. It was about protecting a life he had worked so hard to build. And something told him that, despite Sandra's good intentions, things were only going to get harder. As the cafe quieted down once more, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a battle for respect. It was a war over the very foundation of what Eclipse Cafe stood for, and the people who had fought to keep it alive. The tension in Eclipse Cafe had reached its breaking point. Every time Sandra walked through the door, she could feel it, the subtle shift in the air, the way conversations faltered when certain customers walked in. People who once came for the quiet ambience now seemed unsure, even uncomfortable. It wasn't just the whispers of the elite that had begun to infiltrate the space. It was the impending sense of something bigger, something out of her control. Tom's demeanor had become harder to read. He was distant, almost like a shadow of the man she had come to admire. She had seen him handle conflict before, but this time was different. He was no longer just protecting his cafe. He was protecting his entire world. And it was crumbling bit by bit around him. Sandra could sense the storm brewing. As much as she had tried to stay out of it, to keep a low profile, she was drawn deeper into the conflict every day. Brad Sinclair's influence was no longer just a distant echo. It was everywhere now. Other customers, once strangers who had peacefully enjoyed their time in the cafe, were beginning to look over their shoulders when they came in. Brad's wealthy friends and associates had turned their eyes to Eclipse Cafe, and they were starting to make their presence known. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the cafe's small windows, the door swung open with a sharp jangle. Sandra glanced up, expecting the usual group of after-work patrons. But what she saw instead made her freeze. It was Brad Sinclair again. But this time he wasn't alone. He was flanked by two men who looked out of place in the cozy, artsy interior of the cafe. They were the type of men you only saw in boardrooms and high-end corporate offices. Well-groomed, sharply dressed, and carrying an air of entitlement that seemed to seep through the walls. Sandra watched as Brad scanned the room with a smirk on his face, taking in the space like a conqueror eyeing his next victim. His gaze landed on Tom, who was at the counter, organizing the pastry case with deliberate precision. For a moment, Sandra's heart raced, an instinct telling her that something was about to break. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour," Brad's voice rang out, loud enough for everyone to hear. His tone was mocking, as if he were taunting Tom from across the room. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Tom didn't turn around immediately. His hands were still busy with the pastries, and his face remained expressionless. But Sandra saw the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed just slightly. He wasn't showing fear, but he wasn't fooling anyone. She could feel the air growing thick, every moment bringing them closer to a boiling point. "Can I get you something?" Tom asked coolly, though his voice was barely above a whisper. Brad chuckled, stepping closer to the counter, his eyes scanning the cafe with a disdainful sweep. "I'll have what I always have. Nothing fancy, just enough to remind me that I'm not wasting my time here." He paused, letting the words linger in the air like poison. "I came here because I thought you'd be willing to make a deal, Tom. But I see now that you've chosen to play the fool." The other men flanking Brad exchanged knowing glances, and Sandra could see the gleam of superiority in their eyes. They didn't belong here, not in the way the regulars did. They were here to assert dominance, to remind Tom of the world he had left behind. And that world wasn't done with him yet. Tom straightened up, wiping his hands on a towel as he faced Brad. The calmness in his eyes remained, but there was an undeniable tension in his gaze. "You're mistaken, Brad. I'm not here to make deals. I'm here to run a cafe. That's all." Brad laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the small room. "You think you can just run this little place and ignore everything around you? You're in over your head. It's cute really, this whole underdog routine you're playing. But the reality is, people like you don't belong here. Not in a world like ours." Sandra's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of his words, the same ones that had made her feel small for the better part of her life. She had been in that world, the world where connections, status, and money meant everything. And she had walked away from it, just like Tom. But hearing Brad's words now, directed at Tom, hit her like a punch to the gut. She wanted to speak, to stand up for him, but her voice caught in her throat. What could she say? The truth was, Tom had a point. He wasn't playing a game. He was simply trying to protect the small corner of peace he had created. Before she could react, one of Brad's companions stepped forward, his voice low and menacing. "You're not going to let him talk to you like that, are you? This place is nothing but a joke, and we can make sure it stays that way." Tom's gaze hardened. There was no hesitation now, no calmness. He stepped toward the counter, his fists clenched at his sides. Sandra could see the conflict in his eyes, a deep, almost painful struggle. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about a man who had tried to escape a past that never truly let him go. A past that wanted to drag him back into a world he'd fought so hard to leave behind. "This cafe is my life," Tom said, his voice low, but edged with a strength Sandra hadn't heard before. "It's more than a business. It's a place where people come to feel welcome, to feel human." Brad raised an eyebrow, clearly unbothered. "And you think people like you can actually make a difference in the world? You're fooling yourself." Sandra couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the judgment, it all came crashing down on her. "You're wrong," she said, stepping forward. "This place means something to all of us. To me. I came here for a reason, because it was real. And you're trying to destroy that." Brad's eyes flicked toward her, but there was no remorse, no empathy. Just a cold, dismissive glance that made her feel even smaller. "Stay out of this, Sandra," he sneered. "You wouldn't know real power if it slapped you in the face." Something inside Sandra snapped. She stepped closer, her gaze locked with Brad's. "I've lived in your world. I know exactly what it feels like to be nothing, but a pawn in a game you can't win. But this," she gestured to the room around her. "This is where people are real. People matter here. You can't buy that." The room fell silent. The patrons who had been watching, unsure of how to react, now found themselves hanging on every word. Tom stood beside her, still as a rock, but his eyes softened just enough for Sandra to see the gratitude in them. But before any further words could be exchanged, the door swung open again, this time with a force that rattled the windows. A tall figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the fading light from outside. It was time for the game to change. The figure in the doorway stood there for a moment, casting a long shadow across the room. Sandra's heart skipped a beat, and she could feel the weight of the moment shift. The new arrival, a tall, poised woman in a sharp black coat, looked around the cafe with an air of quiet authority that commanded instant attention. She wasn't just another passerby. There was something unmistakable about her presence. It was as though the world had suddenly frozen, and every eye in the cafe was drawn to her. For a split second, even Brad and his companions seemed to pause, their arrogance momentarily checked by the woman's unspoken power. "Is there a problem here?" the woman asked, her voice smooth but unwavering. She wasn't directing her question at anyone in particular, but the entire room seemed to shift, her presence demanding a response. Brad, ever the opportunist, was quick to react. "Just a little disagreement, nothing worth your time. I was about to have a word with the owner here," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. But the woman didn't take her eyes off him. Her gaze was sharp, direct, like a laser cutting through the nonsense. "I'm not asking you," she replied, her voice hardening with every word. "I'm asking him." Sandra's eyes widened, but she didn't recognize the woman. Tom, however, seemed to react differently. He straightened, his demeanor shifting slightly, though his expression remained neutral. He didn't speak right away, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, a mix of surprise and recognition. Brad, sensing a change, smirked again. "And who might you be? Another one of his little friends? This is a private matter, lady." The woman's lips curled into the slightest of smiles, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm no one's friend. I'm just someone who believes in doing what's right." The tension in the room crackled as the woman slowly walked forward, her gaze never wavering from Brad. "You don't seem to realize who you're dealing with, do you?" she continued, her tone shifting to something far more serious. "Tom Cruise isn't just some cafe owner trying to get by. He's someone who's built something from nothing, something you couldn't even begin to understand." Sandra looked between Tom and the woman, her mind racing. What was happening? Why did the woman speak about Tom with such familiarity? Brad's bravado faltered for the briefest of moments. He tried to regain his confidence, but it was clear that the woman's words had struck a chord. "So what? You're here to protect this little cafe? This isn't about coffee, lady. This is about power. And people like you don't understand that." The woman's eyes narrowed. "No, Brad, you're the one who doesn't understand. Power isn't about intimidation or money. It's about integrity. It's about choosing to do the right thing, even when it's the hardest choice you'll ever make." Tom finally spoke, his voice low but strong. "I walked away from your world a long time ago. I chose to build something real, something that mattered. And I won't let you destroy it." Sandra felt a surge of admiration for him. The calm resolve in his voice was a far cry from the quiet, reserved man she had first met. This was the Tom Cruise she hadn't known. The one who wasn't afraid to fight for what he believed in, no matter the cost. Brad's face reddened with frustration. "You think you can stand up to me? You think a cafe like this is enough to win?" The woman stood beside Tom now, her presence supporting him like a pillar. "This isn't about winning, Brad," she said, her voice firm. "It's about doing what's right. And if you think you can bully your way through this, you've got another thing coming." A stunned silence enveloped the cafe. Brad looked at the woman, at Tom, then back at the room full of people who had witnessed everything. The moment was heavy, charged with anticipation. But it wasn't just about the confrontation anymore. It was about something deeper, something more meaningful than all the power and wealth Brad had accumulated. It was about integrity, humanity, and the courage to stand up when it mattered most. As the silence stretched on, Brad's face twisted with something between anger and disbelief. He turned sharply, storming out of the cafe, his entourage trailing behind him, defeated and bewildered. For a moment no one moved. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the emotions of what had just transpired. And then slowly, the people in the cafe began to clap, their hands coming together in a slow but growing wave of support. It wasn't just applause for the confrontation. They were applauding the courage to stand up, to protect what mattered. Sandra, her heart racing, turned to Tom. "Who was she?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity and wonder. Tom's eyes softened as he looked at her. "That was my sister," he said quietly. "She's the one who taught me that no matter how much we try to walk away from the past, it will always be a part of us. And sometimes, you have to face it head-on to protect what you've built." The weight of his words sank in. Sandra understood now. Tom hadn't just left a life behind. He had built something stronger, something that couldn't be taken from him. The woman, his sister, had reminded him of that strength, and in turn, reminded Sandra of her own courage. The cafe, once again, was filled with the sounds of clinking cups and soft conversations, but this time, there was an air of quiet triumph. Whatever storm had been brewing in Eclipse Cafe was now over, and what remained was something more powerful than wealth, status, or power. What remained was the kind of peace that could only come from standing up for what was right. The cafe was quieter now, the steady hum of conversation flowing freely, no longer tainted by the tension that had once filled the air. Brad Sinclair and his entourage had left in a hurry, their departure leaving a strange sense of calm behind them. But the storm wasn't entirely over. The impact of what had just transpired was still settling over Eclipse Cafe, a place that had, until this moment, been an unassuming sanctuary. Sandra stood by the counter, absently tracing the rim of a coffee cup. Her mind was still racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. She had never expected such an intense confrontation, but what stood out to her most was how Tom had handled it. His words, his calm demeanor. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. But she knew that wasn't true. Tom had built this life, this cafe, piece by piece, and every ounce of it had come at a price. She glanced at him now, wiping down the counter with methodical movements. His face was unreadable, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way he moved. He had faced down the shadow of his past, and it hadn't broken him. "You okay?" Sandra asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Tom paused, his hand stilling on the rag as he met her gaze. There was something different about him now, something unspoken that she couldn't quite put her finger on. "I will be," he said quietly. "I've spent so much time running from who I was, from what I used to be. I never thought I'd be strong enough to stand up for it. But I'm realizing that I've always had the strength. I just needed to remember that." Sandra felt a swell of admiration for him. He wasn't just the man she'd met in the cafe anymore. He was someone more, someone who had survived and rebuilt, someone who had made peace with a past that tried to swallow him whole. There was a soft chime of the door, and Sandra turned to see a few of the regular customers trickling back in. The tension that had once clung to the place was dissipating, replaced by a gentle warmth that hadn't been there earlier. The cafe felt different, lighter. The dark cloud that had loomed over it was gone, and in its place was a sense of resilience. The patrons who had witnessed the confrontation were nodding at each other, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. There was a new respect in the room, a newfound solidarity that bound them all together. Tom stepped away from the counter, giving Sandra a brief nod. "I need to talk to my sister," he said, before walking toward the back room. Sandra watched him go, a strange feeling of pride swelling inside her chest. He had handled everything with such quiet grace, and in doing so, he had shown her more than she could ever have anticipated. A few minutes later, Tom returned with his sister, his posture a little more relaxed, though still exuding the quiet strength that had become so evident in the past few hours. The woman, his sister, smiled at Sandra as she walked up to the counter. She was still dressed in her sharp black coat, but her presence seemed warmer now, as though the battle was over, and she could finally let her guard down. "That was something," Sandra said with a half-laugh, trying to break the ice. The woman, whose name Sandra had learned was Elizabeth, grinned back. "I'm sorry you had to see that. We didn't mean for things to get so intense." "It's fine," Sandra replied, shaking her head. "I'm just glad it's over." Elizabeth's smile softened. "It is for now. But you'll see, Tom's always had a way of staying true to what matters. Even when the world tries to knock him down, he stands his ground." She paused, her eyes flicking toward Tom, who was now leaning against the counter, watching their conversation with a quiet intensity. "And that's what's always made him a fighter. Not the power, not the money, but his integrity. That's the thing Brad never understood, and it's the reason why he'll never win." Sandra nodded, the weight of Elizabeth's words sinking in. She had seen it for herself. Tom had always been more than just a cafe owner, more than just a man hiding from his past. He had built something real, something that had earned the respect of everyone who stepped foot inside. And that, she realized, was his true power. "You know, I wasn't sure what I was walking into when I came here," Sandra said, a little sheepishly. But I'm glad I stayed. This place, it's more than just coffee. Elizabeth's smile grew wider. It's a home. And Tom's never going to let anyone take that away. The room was full now. A steady stream of customers coming in for their usual evening routines. But there was a shift, a sense of belonging in the air that hadn't been there before. As Sandra watched the cafe fill with familiar faces, she couldn't help but feel the warmth of the moment settle over her. The battle had been fought, and Eclipse Cafe was still standing. Tom's journey had been difficult, filled with battles that most people would have avoided. But through it all, he had stayed true to himself, to the values that mattered most. In a world where wealth and power dictated everything, he had built something different, something worth fighting for. And that's what had made all the difference. As the evening wore on, Sandra found herself reflecting on the lessons that had unfolded before her. The importance of standing up for what mattered, the power of integrity, and the reminder that no matter how dark the world may seem, there's always a place where light can shine through. For the first time in a long time, Sandra felt at peace. She wasn't just a part of the cafe, she was part of something bigger, something real. And she knew without a doubt that Tom had made the right choice. His path hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. And as she looked around at the smiling faces, the quiet conversations, and the steady flow of customers, Sandra knew that Eclipse Cafe would always be more than just a business. It would be a testament to the power of staying true to yourself, even when the world tries to make you forget. The story had come full circle, and for the first time, Sandra understood just how much of a difference one person could make. The evening faded into night, and Eclipse Cafe hummed with life. The tension from earlier was a distant memory, replaced by the comforting buzz of familiar voices, the clink of coffee cups, and the soft rhythm of jazz music playing in the background. Tom stood by the counter, his eyes scanning the room, but it wasn't with the same weary vigilance he had carried with him before. There was a sense of peace about him now, a quiet certainty that hadn't been there earlier. Sandra was behind the counter, her hands busy but her mind at ease. She had come to realize that this place, this cafe, wasn't just a business. It was a sanctuary for so many, not just for customers who walked in, but for Tom himself. Eclipse Cafe was his second chance, his rebirth, and tonight, it was a testament to everything he had fought for. Elizabeth, standing by his side, broke the quiet with a gentle smile. "You did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. "You didn't just keep the cafe. You built something even stronger than before. Something that can't be taken." Tom nodded, his eyes warm as he looked at her. "I couldn't have done it alone. You showed me that." Elizabeth's smile grew. "You've always known what mattered. You just needed to remember that the world can't take away what you choose to keep." As she left to join some friends in the back, Tom turned to Sandra. His smile was soft but genuine. "Thanks for sticking around," he said. "I know it wasn't easy, but I'm glad you're here." Sandra felt a warmth spread through her, realizing how much this cafe, and Tom, had impacted her own life. "I'm glad too," she said, the words coming easily. "You've shown me what it means to stand up for something real." Tom looked at her, his expression thoughtful. That's what Eclipse Cafe is about. Not just coffee, not just a place to grab a quick bite, but a place where people can come and be themselves. It's about connection, about community, and it's about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it gets. Sandra paused, reflecting on the lessons of the day, the lessons about integrity, strength, and humility. It had been an unexpected journey for both of them, but now, it felt like they were finally at peace with everything they had fought for. And she knew in her heart that this was just the beginning. The door to the cafe opened once more, and a couple walked in, greeted by the familiar warmth of the space. Tom turned to them, offering a friendly nod as they ordered their drinks. It was an everyday scene, a simple moment, but it felt significant. Sandra could see it now, the ripple effect of everything that had happened. Tom's quiet strength had sparked something in her, something she hadn't realized was missing before. As the evening wore on, more patrons trickled in, each one greeted with a welcoming smile. The cafe was more than just a business. It was a reflection of Tom's journey, his resilience, and his unshakable belief in doing the right thing. No matter who walked through the door, whether they came from wealth or struggle, Eclipse Café was a place where everyone had a seat at the table. And as Sandra watched the world move on, she couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. She wasn't just part of a cafe. She was part of a story that had transformed everyone it touched, including herself. It was late now, but Tom was still there, his eyes scanning the room as the last few customers trickled out. Sandra walked up to him, feeling that same quiet respect she had for him all along. "You've made this place something special," she said, her voice sincere. Tom smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in the soft light. "We've made it something special," he corrected her. "This is just the beginning. The real work is just starting." And as the last lights flickered on in the cafe, it was clear that Eclipse Café would continue to stand as a beacon of hope, a place of integrity and community, where every person who walked in left a little bit changed for the better.